The winter morning arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to cut through everything. Michael Torres had been driving along the abandoned country road for nearly an hour, his truck's heater struggling against the freezing temperatures outside. He was a veterinarian who had spent the last 15 years treating animals in the rural communities outside Denver, and today he was heading to a farm on the outskirts of town to check on some sick cattle. The snow had been falling steadily since dawn, creating a thick white blanket that covered everything in sight. The road ahead was barely visible, and Michael had to slow down to avoid sliding off the icy path. He had made this journey countless times before, but something about today felt different. The silence was deeper, more profound, as if nature itself was holding its breath. As he rounded a sharp bend in the road, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a pile of dark rocks or perhaps some abandoned equipment covered in snow. But as he got closer, his heart skipped a beat. There, huddled together in a ditch beside the road, were 6 large shapes that looked distinctly like dogs. Michael immediately pulled his truck to the side and grabbed his emergency kit from the back seat. Stepping out into the freezing wind, he felt the cold bite at his face instantly. He hurried toward the ditch, his boots crunching through the deep snow. As he approached, his worst fears were confirmed. 6 German shepherds lay motionless in the snow, their beautiful tan and black coats matted with blood and ice. Their bodies were pressed close together, clearly seeking warmth from one another in their desperate final moments. Michael's hands trembled as he knelt beside them, and it wasn't just from the cold. He had seen many heartbreaking cases in his career, but this was different. These weren't wild animals or strays that had wandered too far from home. These were purebred German shepherds, clearly well-bred dogs that someone had cared for at some point. What were they doing out here, bleeding and abandoned in the middle of nowhere? He quickly checked each dog for signs of life, his experienced hands moving swiftly despite the freezing conditions. The first dog, a large male, had a weak pulse. The second, a smaller female, was barely breathing. As he moved from one dog to the next, Michael realized with growing horror that all 6 were still alive, but just barely. They had deep cuts and wounds covering their bodies, and their breathing was shallow and labored. The wounds didn't look like they had come from a wild animal attack. They were too clean, too deliberate. Someone had done this to them. The realization made Michael's blood boil despite the freezing temperature. He had dedicated his life to helping animals, and seeing such cruelty always hit him hard. But there was no time for anger now. These dogs needed help immediately, or they would all die within the hour. Michael ran back to his truck and grabbed every blanket and heating pad he had. He worked quickly, wrapping each dog carefully and checking their injuries more thoroughly. The oldest-looking shepherd had a deep gash across his shoulder. Another had what looked like knife wounds along her side. The youngest, barely more than a puppy, had injuries on all 4 legs. It was clear that these beautiful animals had suffered tremendously. As he worked, Michael noticed something else that broke his heart even further. Despite their terrible condition, the dogs had arranged themselves in a protective circle, with the 2 smallest in the middle. Even in their darkest moment, they were trying to protect each other. The loyalty and love these animals showed for one another, even as they lay dying, brought tears to Michael's eyes. He knew he couldn't transport all 6 dogs in his truck at once, and he couldn't leave any of them behind in this weather. Making a quick decision, he called his assistant, Sarah, who lived about 20 minutes away. His voice was urgent as he explained the situation, and she promised to come immediately with the clinic's larger van. While he waited, Michael did everything he could to stabilize the dogs and keep them warm. The largest male shepherd suddenly opened his eyes and looked directly at Michael. There was so much pain in that gaze, but also a glimmer of hope. The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, as if thanking him for stopping. Michael gently stroked the dog's head, whispering reassurances. He promised them all that he would do everything in his power to save them, no matter what it took. As the snow continued to fall around them, Michael sat in that frozen ditch, surrounded by 6 dying German shepherds, and made a silent vow. He would find out who did this, and he would make sure these beautiful animals got the justice they deserved. But first, he had to keep them alive. The real fight was just beginning, and Michael Torres was not the kind of man who gave up easily. These dogs had survived this long against impossible odds, and he was determined to give them a fighting chance at life. Sarah arrived faster than Michael had expected, her van sliding slightly as she pulled up behind his truck. She jumped out with medical supplies, her face pale with shock when she saw the condition of the dogs. Together, they carefully loaded each shepherd into the van, working as quickly as possible while still being gentle with their injured bodies. The dogs were so weak that none of them resisted, which worried Michael even more than if they had fought back. The drive to the clinic was tense and silent except for the occasional whimper from the back of the van. Michael sat in the passenger seat, constantly looking back to monitor the dogs. One of the females had stopped breathing twice, and each time he had to climb into the back to perform emergency resuscitation. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline. When they finally reached the North Valley Veterinary Clinic, Michael's small team was already waiting. He had called ahead, and his two other assistants, James and Maria, had prepared the surgical room and recovery area. They had worked together for years, and everyone knew exactly what needed to be done without being told. The clinic transformed into an emergency rescue operation within minutes. They split into two teams, with Michael taking the three most critical cases while Sarah handled the others. The work was intense and exhausting. Michael operated on the large male first, the one who had looked at him with those hopeful eyes. The dog had lost a dangerous amount of blood and his body temperature was critically low. Michael worked for 2 hours straight, stitching wounds, administering antibiotics, and doing everything medically possible to stabilize him. The injuries told a disturbing story. These weren't accidental wounds or the result of a dogfight. Someone had deliberately hurt these animals with a sharp object, possibly a knife or broken glass. Some of the cuts were defensive wounds, suggesting the dogs had tried to protect themselves or each other. The cruelty involved made Michael feel sick, but he pushed those feelings aside and focused on saving lives. By late afternoon, all 6 dogs were out of immediate danger, but their conditions remained critical. Michael had set up recovery kennels in the clinic's largest room, arranging them so the dogs could see each other. He had noticed during treatment that whenever one dog showed signs of distress, the others would try to respond even in their weakened state. Keeping them together seemed important for their emotional recovery as much as their physical healing. As the sun began to set, Michael finally allowed himself to sit down. He was covered in blood, utterly exhausted, and running on nothing but coffee and determination. Sarah brought him a sandwich, but he could barely eat. All he could think about was those 6 beautiful dogs fighting for their lives in the next room, and the monster who had done this to them. He decided to call the local police and report what he had found. Officer David Chen arrived within the hour, a notebook in hand and a grim expression on his face. Michael showed him photographs he had taken of the injuries and explained his professional opinion about how they were inflicted. David listened carefully, his jaw tightening with anger as Michael described the scene. David explained that there had been reports of missing dogs in the area over the past few months, but nothing like this had ever happened before. He promised to open an investigation immediately and asked Michael to save any evidence, including the dogs' collars if they had any. Unfortunately, none of the shepherds had been wearing identification tags, which made finding their owner more difficult. That night, Michael decided to stay at the clinic. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving the dogs alone, not after everything they had been through. He set up a cot in the recovery room and tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every few minutes he would get up to check on the dogs, adjusting their IV drips, monitoring their vital signs, and simply talking to them softly. Around midnight, something remarkable happened. The large male shepherd, the one Michael had operated on first, opened his eyes fully for the first time since the surgery. The dog looked directly at Michael, and this time there was more than just pain in his gaze. There was recognition, understanding, and gratitude. The shepherd's tail wagged weakly, thumping softly against the padded floor of his kennel. Michael felt tears stream down his face as he knelt beside the kennel. He reached through the bars and gently stroked the dog's head, careful to avoid his bandaged wounds. The shepherd leaned into the touch, and Michael could have sworn he saw the dog smile. It was a small victory, but in that moment it meant everything. This brave animal was choosing to fight, choosing to live. One by one, the other dogs began to stir. It was as if the big male's awakening had signaled to the others that it was safe to come back. Michael watched in amazement as each shepherd opened their eyes and looked around, searching for their pack members. When they saw that all 6 were together and safe, a visible sense of calm settled over the room. Michael spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor between the kennels, his hand reaching out to touch each dog in turn. He talked to them about everything and nothing, his voice a constant source of comfort in the quiet darkness. He told them about his own dog that he had loved as a child, about the farm animals he would be visiting tomorrow, about how spring would come eventually and the snow would melt. As dawn broke through the clinic windows, painting everything in soft orange light, Michael finally understood something important. These 6 German shepherds had survived something terrible, something that should have killed them. But they had refused to give up on each other, and now they were refusing to give up on life. Their story wasn't over. In fact, Michael realized it was only just beginning. He stood up, his body aching from sleeping on the hard floor, and looked at each dog with renewed determination. They had made it through the worst night. Now came the hard part, helping them heal, finding out what had happened to them and making sure the person responsible would face justice. Michael was ready for the challenge. These dogs deserved nothing less than his absolute best effort, and that was exactly what they were going to get. The next few days at the clinic were a blur of constant activity and careful monitoring. Michael barely left the building, surviving on quick naps and takeout food that Sarah insisted on bringing him. The 6 German shepherds were showing signs of improvement, but their recovery was slow and required round-the-clock attention. Each dog needed medication administered at different times, wounds needed to be cleaned and rebandaged, and they all required careful feeding since their bodies were still weak from trauma and blood loss. Michael had started giving the dogs temporary names based on their personalities. The large male who had first made eye contact with him became Atlas, because he seemed to carry the weight of protecting the others, even in his weakened state. The smallest female, who had been in the center of the protective circle, was named Hope. There was also Brave, Shadow Spirit, and the youngest one he called Chance, because the puppy had the worst injuries but somehow kept fighting. News of the rescue had begun to spread through the small community. Sarah had posted about it on the clinic's social media page, and within hours the story had been shared hundreds of times. People were outraged by the cruelty and moved by Michael's dedication to saving the dogs. The clinic's phone rang constantly with people offering donations, volunteers wanting to help, and reporters asking for interviews. Officer David Chen visited the clinic again on the 3rd day with some troubling news. He had canvassed the area where Michael had found the dogs and discovered something disturbing about a mile up the road. There were signs of a struggle in an abandoned barn, including bloodstains and what appeared to be makeshift cages. Someone had been keeping dogs there and not for any good purpose. David explained that they were investigating a possible dog-fighting ring. The injuries on the shepherds were consistent with what they sometimes saw in fighting dogs, though German shepherds weren't typically used for that purpose. It was also possible that the dogs had been stolen and were being held for ransom, or worse, being trained as guard dogs through brutal methods. Whatever the truth was, it painted a dark picture of what these animals had endured. Michael felt his anger rising again as David spoke, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting emotional wouldn't help the dogs or bring their abusers to justice. What mattered now was gathering evidence and building a case. David asked if he could take photos and collect samples from the dogs' wounds for the investigation. Michael agreed immediately, knowing that this evidence might be crucial in court. As the days passed, the dogs continued to heal physically, but Michael noticed something else that concerned him. They were still traumatized. Atlas would flinch whenever anyone approached too quickly. Hope refused to eat unless she could see all the other dogs. Brave would sometimes wake up from sleep with a terrified whimper. These beautiful animals carried invisible scars that would take much longer to heal than their physical wounds. Michael decided to contact his friend Rachel, an animal behaviorist who specialized in trauma recovery. Rachel had worked with abused animals for over 20 years and had seen just about everything. When she arrived at the clinic and saw the 6 shepherds, her eyes filled with tears. She spent hours observing them, taking notes on their behavior and interactions with each other. Rachel explained to Michael that the dogs showed classic signs of severe trauma and abuse. They had developed something similar to PTSD, and their recovery would require patience, consistency, and a lot of love. She suggested starting with simple trust-building exercises and recommended keeping them together as much as possible, since they clearly drew comfort from each other's presence. Rachel volunteered to come by several times a week to work with them, refusing to accept any payment for her services. The community's response to the dog's story continued to grow. A local news station did a feature on the rescue and the video went viral. Within a week, the clinic had received over $50,000 in donations, specifically for the shepherd's care. People from across the country sent letters, cards, and gifts for the dogs. Children drew pictures of German shepherds and wrote messages of hope. The outpouring of love was overwhelming, but with the attention came complications. Dozens of people claimed to be the dog's owners, calling the clinic with elaborate stories about how their pets had been stolen. Michael had to screen each call carefully, asking specific questions about the dog's appearance, behavior, and any identifying marks. Most of the callers couldn't provide accurate details, and Michael suspected they were simply hoping to claim the now famous rescue dogs. Then, on the 10th day after the rescue, a call came that was different from all the others. A woman named Margaret Sullivan called the clinic, her voice shaking with emotion. She described 6 German shepherds in perfect detail, including a small scar above Atlas's left eye that Michael had noticed but hadn't mentioned publicly. She knew about Hope's unusual habit of tilting her head to the right when confused. She even knew that Chance had a birthmark on his belly that looked like a heart. Margaret explained through tears that the dogs had been stolen from her breeding facility 3 months earlier. Someone had cut through the fence in the middle of the night and taken her 6 best breeding dogs, worth over $60,000. She had filed police reports and searched everywhere, posting flyers and offering rewards, but had found nothing. She had almost given up hope of ever seeing them again. Michael asked Margaret to come to the clinic immediately. When she arrived an hour later, accompanied by Officer Chen, the reaction from the dogs was unmistakable. The moment Margaret walked into the recovery room, all 6 shepherds began to whine and wag their tails frantically. Atlas actually stood up on shaky legs for the first time since the rescue, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. Margaret fell to her knees, sobbing as she reached through the kennel bars to touch each dog. She spoke their real names, names that Michael and his team hadn't known. Atlas was actually named Thor. Hope was Freya. The others were called Odin, Loki, Sif, and little Chance was really named Baldur. The dogs responded to each name, their joy at seeing their person again evident in every movement. Michael watched the reunion with mixed emotions. He was happy that the mystery of the dogs' origins had been solved and that they would be returning to someone who clearly loved them. But over the past 10 days, he had grown deeply attached to these brave survivors. The idea of saying goodbye to them hurt more than he had expected. Still, he knew this was the right thing. These dogs belonged with Margaret, in a home where they were loved and valued. Margaret spent the next hour at the clinic, sitting with her dogs and listening to Michael explain everything that had happened. She cried when she saw their injuries and heard about the abuse they had suffered. She was devastated by what they had been through, but incredibly grateful that Michael had found them when he did. Without his intervention, she knew all 6 would have died in that frozen ditch. Margaret Sullivan owned Green Valley Kennels, a reputable breeding facility about 40 miles from where Michael had found the dogs. She had been breeding German shepherds for over 20 years, focusing on producing healthy, well-tempered dogs for families, service work, and search and rescue programs. Her facility was known throughout the region for its ethical practices and the quality care she provided her animals. As Margaret talked with Officer Chen, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. 3 months ago, on a cold November night, someone had broken into her property. They hadn't stolen any money or equipment, only the 6 dogs. Margaret had breeding records, veterinary histories, and registration papers for each shepherd, which would be crucial evidence in the criminal investigation. She also had security camera footage from that night, though the perpetrators had worn masks and gloves. Officer Chen explained that with Margaret's evidence combined with what they had found at the abandoned barn, they were building a strong case. The police believed the dogs had been stolen by an organized group that was involved in multiple illegal activities, including dogfighting, illegal breeding operations, and possibly selling stolen purebred dogs on the black market. The investigation now involved multiple agencies and arrests were expected soon. Michael was relieved to hear that justice might finally be served, but his immediate concern was the dog's continued recovery. He explained to Margaret that while the shepherds were healing physically, they still needed weeks of medical care and behavioral therapy. Their wounds required daily attention, they were on several medications, and they needed the stability of their current environment until they were stronger. Margaret completely understood and agreed that the dogs should stay at the clinic until Michael felt they were ready to go home. She visited every single day, spending hours with her beloved shepherds, talking to them, grooming them gently around their injuries, and slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered by their traumatic experience. Michael could see the positive effect her presence had on all 6 dogs. They were more alert, more willing to eat, and showed less fear when the clinic staff approached them. Rachel, the animal behaviorist, was impressed by the progress. She worked closely with both Michael and Margaret, creating a comprehensive rehabilitation plan for each dog. The plan included gradual desensitization to triggers that caused fear responses, positive reinforcement training to rebuild confidence, and eventually, carefully supervised socialization with other dogs and people. Rachel emphasized that recovery from trauma was not linear and that there would be setbacks, but she was optimistic about the dog's long-term prognosis. The media attention continued to grow. The story of the 6 German shepherds had captured hearts across the country. A national morning show contacted Michael, asking if they could do a segment on the rescue. He initially hesitated, not wanting to exploit the dog's suffering. But Margaret convinced him that sharing their story might help other abused animals by raising awareness about animal cruelty and the importance of rescue work. The television segment aired 3 weeks after Michael had found the dogs in the snow. It featured interviews with Michael, Margaret, and Officer Chen, along with footage of the shepherds in their recovery kennels. The response was overwhelming. The clinic's donation fund grew to over $200,000. Animal shelters across the country reported increased volunteer applications and adoption inquiries. People were inspired by the story of survival and the dedication shown by everyone involved in the rescue. But not all the attention was positive. A few days after the broadcast, the clinic received a threatening phone call. A man's voice, distorted and angry, warned Michael to stop talking to the media and to mind his own business. The caller hung up before Michael could respond. He immediately reported the threat to Officer Chen, who took it very seriously. The police increased patrols around the clinic and installed additional security cameras. The threat made everyone nervous, but it also strengthened their resolve. Michael refused to be intimidated. These dogs had fought too hard for their lives, and he had invested too much in their recovery to back down now. Sarah and the rest of the clinic staff felt the same way. They installed better locks, implemented new security protocols, and made sure someone was always with the dogs, especially at night. As the 4th week approached, the shepherds showed remarkable improvement. Thor, the large male who had been Atlas to Michael, was walking confidently again and had regained most of his strength. Freya, Little Hope, was eating normally and had started playing with toys for the first time. Even Baldur, the youngest with the most severe injuries, was running around his recovery kennel, his puppy energy finally returning. Michael began preparing for their eventual departure. It would be bittersweet, saying goodbye to these incredible animals who had become such a huge part of his life. He had spent nearly a month caring for them, worrying about them, celebrating each small victory in their recovery. The bond he had formed with each dog was deep and meaningful, but he knew they needed to go home. Margaret had been preparing as well. She had made modifications to her facility's security, installing a state-of-the-art alarm system, motion-activated lighting, and reinforced fencing. She had also built a special recovery area where the dogs could continue their rehabilitation in a safe, comfortable environment. Local volunteers from the community had helped with the construction, all of them moved by the shepherd's story and wanting to contribute to their healing. Officer Chen visited the clinic with good news. The police had made several arrests in connection with the dog theft and abuse case. A man named Vincent Kozlov and 3 accomplices had been charged with multiple crimes, including animal cruelty, theft, operating an illegal dogfighting operation, and various other offenses. The evidence was strong, and the prosecutor was confident they would get convictions. The maximum penalties for their crimes could result in years in prison and substantial fines. The breakthrough in the case had come from an unexpected source. One of the people who had called claiming to own the dogs was actually a former associate of Kozlov, who had decided to cooperate with police after seeing the news coverage. He was disgusted by what had been done to the German shepherds and provided detailed information about the criminal operation. including the location of the barn and the names of everyone involved. Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders when he heard about the arrests. Justice was being served, and the people responsible for hurting these beautiful animals would face consequences for their actions. More importantly, it meant that Margaret could take her dogs home without fear that they would be targeted again. The nightmare was finally coming to an end. Rachel conducted a final behavioral assessment of all 6 shepherds and declared them ready to transition back to their home. They still showed some signs of trauma and would benefit from continued therapy, but they had made incredible progress. Their physical wounds had healed well, with only scars remaining as reminders of what they had endured. Their spirits, once broken, had been rebuilt through patience, love, and expert care. The day came for the dogs to leave the clinic. Michael had known it was coming, but he still wasn't prepared for how emotional he felt. Sarah, James, and Maria were all teary-eyed as they helped load the shepherds into Margaret's specially equipped van. Each dog was given a final checkup, a gentle hug, and a treat for the road. Michael knelt down and said goodbye to each one individually, thanking them for teaching him about resilience, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of animals who refuse to give up. The clinic felt strangely empty after the German shepherds left. Michael found himself walking past the recovery room multiple times throughout the day, forgetting for a moment that the dogs were no longer there. Sarah noticed his melancholy mood and suggested they take a few days to rest and recover from the intense month they had just experienced. The whole team was exhausted both physically and emotionally, but they all agreed it had been worth every sleepless night and every moment of stress. Margaret called Michael every evening with updates on how the shepherds were settling in at Green Valley Kennels. The transition was going better than expected. The dogs seemed relieved to be back in familiar surroundings, and their comfort with Margaret was evident in their behavior. Thor had immediately claimed his old favorite spot under a tree in the outdoor play area. Freya had curled up in the same corner of the kennel building where she had always slept. It was as if they knew they were finally home and safe. However, the trauma they had experienced still manifested in various ways. Loud noises would send Odin into a panic. Sif refused to go near the fence line where the break-in had occurred. Loki would sometimes wake up at night with frightened whimpers. Margaret worked patiently with each dog, following the behavioral protocols Rachel had established. She never rushed them or forced them to confront their fears before they were ready. Progress came in small steps, but it came steadily. Rachel continued her work with the shepherds, making the drive to Green Valley Kennels twice a week. She was amazed by their resilience and their ability to begin trusting again, despite everything they had been through. One of her techniques involved controlled exposure to positive experiences that countered their negative associations. For example, she worked with Odin on becoming comfortable with sudden sounds by pairing them with treats and play. Over time, his fear response began to diminish. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Vincent Kozlov and his associates were moving forward. Officer Chen kept Michael and Margaret informed about the case's progress. The evidence was overwhelming. In addition to the testimony from the cooperating witness, police had found DNA evidence linking the defendants to the crime scene, financial records showing illegal transactions related to stolen dogs, and communications discussing their criminal activities. The prosecutor was seeking the maximum penalties available under state law. The trial was scheduled for early spring, and both Michael and Margaret were called to testify as witnesses. Michael would speak about the condition he found the dogs in, the extent of their injuries, and his professional assessment of how those injuries were inflicted. Margaret would provide testimony about the theft, the value of the dogs, and the impact their loss and suffering had on her and her business. Rachel would also testify as an expert witness about the psychological trauma the dogs had experienced. As winter slowly gave way to spring, something beautiful began happening at Green Valley Kennels. The 6 German shepherds were not just recovering, they were thriving. Their physical health had returned completely, with their coats glossy and their bodies strong and muscular again. Their emotional healing, while slower, was progressing remarkably well. They were playing together, engaging with Margaret and her staff, and showing interest in training exercises. Michael visited the kennels regularly, unable to stay away from the dogs who had become so important to him. Each visit filled him with joy as he witnessed their continued improvement. Thor would greet him with enthusiastic barks and a wildly wagging tail. Little Baldur, who had been so close to death when Michael first found him, now ran circles around the play yard with boundless puppy energy. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The community's support never wavered. The donation fund that had been established for the shepherd's care had grown so large that Margaret and Michael decided to use the excess money to create a foundation. The Sick Shepherds Foundation would provide financial assistance to veterinary clinics and animal shelters dealing with abuse and cruelty cases. They wanted to ensure that other animals in desperate situations would receive the same level of care that Thor, Freya, Odin, Loki, Sif, and Baldur had received. The foundation's launch received significant media coverage, bringing even more attention to the issue of animal cruelty. Margaret and Michael were interviewed by newspapers, magazines, and television programs. They spoke passionately about the need for stronger animal protection laws, better funding for rescue operations, and more severe penalties for those who abuse animals. Their advocacy work began to make a real difference, with several legislators introducing bills to strengthen animal cruelty statutes. One afternoon in early April, Margaret called Michael with exciting news that brought tears to his eyes. Freya, the small female shepherd who had been so traumatized that she initially refused to eat or interact with anyone, had just successfully completed her therapy dog certification test. She had worked with Rachel for months, overcoming her fears and learning to trust again. Now she was certified to visit hospitals, schools, and nursing homes, bringing comfort to people in need. Her transformation from a terrified, abused animal to a certified therapy dog was extraordinary. Margaret had plans for the other shepherds as well. Thor was being trained for search and rescue work, his natural leadership abilities and keen intelligence making him perfect for the role. Odin and Loki were working toward certification as service dogs for veterans with PTSD. Sif was showing promise as an emotional support animal. Even young Baldur, despite his rough start in life, was being prepared for a career in police canine work. These dogs who had suffered so much would now spend their lives helping others. The trial date finally arrived in late April. The courthouse was packed with supporters, media representatives, and animal welfare advocates. Michael sat in the witness stand and described in detail the morning he found the 6 shepherds bleeding in the snow. His voice remained steady and professional, but the emotion behind his words was unmistakable. He presented the photographs he had taken that day, images that caused audible gasps from the jury members. Margaret's testimony was equally powerful. She spoke about the horror of discovering her dogs had been stolen, the months of desperate searching, and the joy mixed with heartbreak when she learned they had been found but severely injured. She described the impact on her business and her life, but emphasized that the real victims were the dogs themselves, innocent animals who had been subjected to unimaginable cruelty for no reason, other than human greed and callousness. Rachel's expert testimony provided crucial insight into the psychological damage inflicted on the shepherds. She explained how trauma affects animals, the long-term consequences of severe abuse, and the extensive therapy required for recovery. She told the jury about nightmares, fear responses, and trust issues that the dogs still struggled with months after their rescue. Her testimony made it clear that the defendant's actions had caused lasting harm that went far beyond physical injuries. The defense attorneys tried to minimize the severity of the crimes, suggesting that the defendants were simply involved in an illegal business venture and hadn't intended to seriously harm the animals. The prosecution quickly countered this argument by presenting evidence of deliberate cruelty, including veterinary testimony about injuries that could only have been caused by intentional violence. The jury looked increasingly disturbed as more evidence was presented. After 3 days of testimony and evidence presentation, the case went to the jury. The deliberation lasted only 4 hours. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty on all counts, Vincent Kozlov and his 3 accomplices were convicted of animal cruelty, theft, operating an illegal dogfighting ring, conspiracy, and several other charges. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, but indicated that substantial prison time would be appropriate given the severity and premeditated nature of the crimes. Michael felt a sense of relief and vindication wash over him as the verdict was read. Justice had been served. The people who had hurt those 6 beautiful German shepherds would face serious consequences for their actions. But more than that, this case had brought attention to the issue of animal cruelty in a way that could lead to real, lasting change. The shepherd's suffering had not been in vain. It had become a catalyst for protection of countless other animals. The sentencing hearing took place on a warm May morning. The courtroom was once again filled with people who had followed the case from the beginning. Vincent Kozloff received 15 years in prison, while his accomplices received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. The judge delivered a scathing statement about the depravity required to inflict such suffering on innocent animals, calling the defendants' actions a stain on humanity's relationship with the creatures we have a moral obligation to protect. In addition to prison time, the defendants were ordered to pay substantial fines and restitution to Margaret for the theft and veterinary costs. They were also permanently banned from owning, working with, or living with any animals for the rest of their lives. The judge made it clear that animal cruelty would not be tolerated in their jurisdiction, and hoped this case would send a strong message to anyone considering similar crimes. Outside the courthouse, Michael and Margaret were surrounded by reporters and well-wishers. People thanked them for their dedication and courage in seeing the case through to the end. Children held signs with pictures of the 6 German shepherds, calling them heroes. Margaret announced that she would be bringing all 6 dogs to a public event the following week, where people could meet the survivors and learn more about the 6 Shepherds Foundation. The celebration event was held at the city's largest park on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Thousands of people showed up, far more than anyone had anticipated. Families with children, elderly couples, young adults, and people from all walks of life came together to celebrate the miraculous recovery of 6 dogs who had refused to give up. Food trucks donated their services. Local businesses set up information booths about animal welfare, and rescue organizations brought adoptable dogs hoping to find forever homes. Michael arrived early to help Margaret prepare. The 6 German shepherds were groomed to perfection, wearing special bandanas that read "Survivor" across the front. Despite the large crowd, the dogs remained calm and friendly, a testament to the extensive socialization work Rachel had done with them. Thor stood tall and proud, his bearing regal and confident. Freya wagged her tail gently as children approached to pet her. The transformation from the bleeding, terrified animals Michael had found in the snow was complete and absolute. The event began with speeches from local officials, including the mayor, who praised Michael's quick action and Margaret's unwavering commitment to her animals. Officer Chen spoke about the importance of reporting animal cruelty and how community vigilance had helped bring criminals to justice. Then Michael was called to the podium to share his story. He stood before the crowd feeling nervous despite all the media appearances he had done over the past months. But when he looked down and saw Thor sitting calmly beside Margaret, watching him with those intelligent brown eyes, the words came easily. Michael described that cold winter morning when he had rounded the bend and seen what he thought was just rocks in the snow. He talked about the moment he realized they were dogs and the horror he felt seeing their injuries. He described the desperate race to save their lives and the emotional toll of those first critical days. His voice broke slightly as he told the crowd about the night when Thor had first opened his eyes and looked at him with hope instead of fear. He explained how that moment had changed everything, how it had reminded him why he became a veterinarian in the first place. It wasn't just about treating sick animals, it was about giving them a chance at life, about being their voice when they couldn't speak for themselves, about refusing to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. The crowd was silent as Michael spoke, hanging on every word. When he finished, the applause was thunderous and sustained. People were crying, moved by the story of compassion and dedication. Children ran up to Michael, hugging him and thanking him for saving the dogs. Parents shook his hand, telling him he was a hero. Michael felt embarrassed by the attention, but grateful that the shepherd's story had touched so many hearts. Margaret spoke next, sharing her perspective on the ordeal. She talked about the devastating night her dogs were stolen, the endless months of searching, and the call that had given her both hope and despair when she learned they had been found, but were critically injured. She thanked Michael and his team at the clinic for the extraordinary care they had provided, emphasizing that without their skill and dedication, none of the 6 shepherds would have survived. She also announced something special. The 6 Shepherds Foundation had received enough donations to fund a new program that would provide free emergency veterinary care for abuse and cruelty cases at clinics throughout the state. Any veterinarian who treated an animal found in similar circumstances to the German shepherds could apply for funding to cover the costs. The program would ensure that financial considerations never prevented an animal from receiving life-saving treatment. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. Rachel, the animal behaviorist, stepped forward to speak about the psychological aspects of animal recovery and the importance of addressing trauma in abused animals. She explained that physical healing was only part of the journey, and that emotional rehabilitation required time, patience, and specialized knowledge. The foundation would also be funding training programs to help veterinarians and shelter workers better understand and treat animal trauma. As the speeches concluded, Margaret brought out all 6 German Shepherds to meet the crowd. The dogs were divided into 2 groups with handlers to ensure they wouldn't be overwhelmed. People formed orderly lines, waiting patiently for their chance to pet the famous survivors and take photos. The shepherds handled the attention beautifully, their tails wagging as they greeted each person with gentle dignity. Michael watched from a short distance, his heart swelling with pride and emotion. These magnificent animals had been through hell and back, yet here they stood bringing joy to thousands of people. They weren't just survivors. They were ambassadors for all abused and neglected animals, living proof that with proper care and compassion, even the most broken creatures could heal and thrive. A little girl, perhaps 7 years old, approached Michael timidly. She held a drawing of a German Shepherd in her small hands. The picture was simple but drawn with obvious care, showing a dog surrounded by hearts and stars. She handed it to Michael and whispered, "Thank you for saving them. When I grow up, I want to save animals too, just like you." Michael knelt down to the girl's level, taking the drawing with reverence. He told her that the world needed more people who cared about animals, and he was certain she would make a wonderful veterinarian or rescue worker someday. The girl beamed with pride and ran back to her parents, who smiled gratefully at Michael. In that moment, he realized the full impact of what had happened. This wasn't just about 6 dogs anymore. It was about inspiring a new generation to care, to act, and to make a difference. As the sun began to set on the park, casting golden light across the crowds of people still waiting to meet the shepherds, Michael reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them all to this moment. It had started with a chance discovery on a frozen road, a split-second decision to stop and investigate. If he had been driving just a little faster, if the snow had been falling harder, if he had been distracted for even a moment, he might have missed seeing the dogs entirely. They would have died in that ditch, alone and forgotten, but fate, luck, or divine intervention had put him in the right place at the right time. And once he had found them, there was never any question about what he would do. He would fight for them with everything he had, just as they had fought to survive. Together they had overcome impossible odds, and now their story was changing lives and creating a legacy that would help countless other animals in the future. 1 year after Michael had found the 6 German Shepherds bleeding in the snow, Green Valley Kennels hosted a special anniversary celebration. The event was more intimate than the massive public gathering in the park, attended only by the people who had been directly involved in the rescue and recovery. Michael arrived with Sarah, James, and Maria from the clinic. Rachel came with detailed progress reports on each dog's behavioral development. Officer David Chen attended in civilian clothes, bringing his own German Shepherd to meet the famous 6. Local reporters were invited to document how far the shepherds had come in 12 months. The transformation at Green Valley Kennels was remarkable. Margaret had expanded her facility with the help of community donations and volunteers. There was now a specialized rehabilitation center designed specifically for traumatized animals, complete with quiet rooms for anxiety reduction, obstacle courses for confidence building, and comfortable spaces where animals could simply exist without pressure or expectations. The center bore a bronze plaque that read, "In honor of Thor, Freya, Odin, Loki, Sif, and Baldur, survivors and inspirations." The 6 shepherds themselves were barely recognizable as the broken, bleeding animals from that terrible winter morning. Thor had completed his search and rescue training and had already participated in 3 successful missions, helping locate a lost child, an elderly man with dementia, and a hiker injured on a mountain trail. His work had saved lives, turning his own survival into something even more meaningful. He wore his working vest with pride, and the confidence in his bearing was unmistakable. Freya had become the most sought-after therapy dog in the region. She visited children's hospitals weekly, bringing comfort to young patients facing scary medical procedures. She also worked with a program that helped children testify in court cases, her calming presence making it easier for traumatized kids to share their difficult stories. The staff at the hospital had started calling her their angel. Doug and children would ask when Freya was coming long before their own family visits. Odin and Loki had been placed, together with a military veteran named Robert Martinez, who suffered from severe PTSD after serving 3 tours overseas. Robert had struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and the inability to connect with civilian life. The 2 German shepherds had changed everything for him. They provided emotional support, helped him manage panic attacks, and gave him a sense of purpose. Robert attended the anniversary event specifically to thank Michael and Margaret, bringing photos that showed him smiling genuinely for the first time in years, with Odin and Loki by his side. Sif had found her calling working with the local police department's victim services unit. She accompanied officers on domestic violence calls and child welfare checks, her gentle presence helping to calm frightened families in crisis situations. Her handler, Officer Jennifer Walsh, explained how Sif seemed to instinctively know who needed comfort most in any given situation. The dog would approach scared children or traumatized adults with a softness that immediately put them at ease, creating a bridge of trust that made the officers' difficult jobs a little easier. Young Baldur, who had been the puppy with the most severe injuries, had grown into a magnificent adult dog. He was currently in advanced training for narcotics detection work and showing exceptional aptitude. His trainer reported that Baldur had an incredible nose and an eagerness to work that made him a natural for police canine duties. Within 6 months, he would be partnered with an officer and begin his career protecting the community from drug trafficking. The puppy who had nearly died in the snow would grow up to be a hero in his own right. Margaret gave a presentation about the impact of the Six Shepherds Foundation over the past year. The numbers were staggering and deeply moving. The foundation had provided funding for the emergency treatment of over 200 abused and neglected animals. They had sponsored training programs that taught 300 veterinarians and animal welfare workers about trauma-informed care for rescued animals. They had successfully lobbied for the passage of stricter animal cruelty laws in their state, which had been signed into law just 2 months earlier. The foundation had also established a scholarship program for veterinary students who demonstrated a commitment to animal welfare and rescue work. 5 students had received full scholarships for the upcoming academic year, their education funded by people who had been moved by the shepherd's story. These future veterinarians would carry forward the mission of compassionate care for animals who had nowhere else to turn. Michael shared his own reflections on the year. The experience had changed him profoundly, he admitted. He had been a veterinarian for 15 years before finding the shepherds, and he had always loved his work. But something about that morning and the months that followed had reminded him of the true power of his profession. Veterinarians weren't just medical professionals. They were advocates, rescuers, and sometimes the last line of defense for creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. He had made changes in his practice as a result. The North Valley Veterinary Clinic now offered a program where they provided free or reduced-cost emergency care for rescued animals brought in by Good Samaritans or animal welfare organizations. They had treated dozens of cases in the past year, from dogs hit by cars to cats with severe infections to wildlife injured by human activity. Every single animal received the same level of care that Thor, Freya, Odin, Loki, Sif, and Baldur had received, regardless of ability to pay. Sarah spoke about the emotional impact on the clinic staff. She explained how watching the shepherds fight for their lives and eventually thrive had reinforced why they had all chosen careers in animal care. The long hours, the emotional difficulty, the physical exhaustion. It all made sense when they saw results like these 6 magnificent dogs. The clinic had hired 2 additional staff members to handle the increased workload from their rescue program, and they had applications from several more people wanting to join their mission-driven practice. Rachel provided a professional assessment of the shepherd's psychological recovery. From a behavioral standpoint, all 6 dogs had made remarkable progress that exceeded her initial projections. While they still showed some residual signs of their trauma, primarily heightened startle responses and occasional anxiety in specific situations, they had developed healthy coping mechanisms and strong bonds with their handlers or families. Their ability to not just survive but to flourish in demanding working Rolls was extraordinary and spoke to both their inherent resilience and the quality of care they had received. Officer Chen shared updates on the broader criminal investigation. The convictions of Kozlov and his associates had led to additional arrests in a multi-state dog theft and fighting ring. Over 40 dogs had been rescued from various locations, and numerous other criminals were now facing charges. The case had become a landmark prosecution that was being studied by law enforcement agencies across the country as a model for investigating organized animal cruelty operations. As the formal presentations concluded, Margaret made one final announcement. She had been working with the state legislature on a new bill that would require mandatory reporting of suspected animal abuse by veterinarians and create a statewide database to track animal cruelty offenders. The bill, nicknamed Thor's Law after the lead shepherd, would make it harder for animal abusers to simply move to new communities and start over. Several legislators were confident it would pass in the next session. The evening concluded with everyone gathering around the 6 German shepherds for a group photograph. The dogs sat calmly in a line, their handlers beside them with Michael and Margaret in the center. As the photographer counted down, Thor suddenly barked once clearly and loudly as if he was making an announcement. The other 5 shepherds immediately joined in, their voices rising in a chorus that sounded almost celebratory. Everyone laughed and the photographer captured the moment perfectly. An image of joy, triumph, and the unbreakable bonds formed through shared adversity. After the other guests had left, Michael stayed behind for a few quiet minutes with the shepherds. He walked through the facility with Margaret, visiting each dog individually. He saved Thor for last, approaching the big male who had been the first to look at him with hope on that terrible morning 12 months ago. Thor wagged his tail in recognition and pushed his head against Michael's hand for pets. Michael knelt beside Thor, running his hands through the dog's thick coat, feeling the scars hidden beneath the fur. These scars were reminders of pain and suffering, but also of survival and strength. They told a story that would never be forgotten, a story of cruelty overcome by compassion, of despair transformed into hope, of death cheated by determination and love. He thought about that cold winter morning when he had almost driven past, when he had very nearly missed seeing the dark shapes in the snow. He thought about the split-second decision to stop, to investigate, to act. That one moment, that single choice had changed everything. It had saved 6 lives, inspired thousands of people, created a foundation that would help countless animals, and reminded everyone involved why kindness and compassion were the most important values anyone could hold.